There are many ways to measure a person's worth: framed diplomas, professional titles, six-figure salaries. In the Foster family, these were the only metrics that mattered. "Ruby, you need to face reality," my father pronounced that December night, adjusting his glasses the way he always did when about to deliver one of his final, unquestionable verdicts. "You're 25, you've dropped out of college 3 times, and you still live under our roof with no career prospects." Around the Christmas dinner table, the disapproving glances were almost tangible. My sister Melissa, the Harvard-trained cardiologist who had just been named head of a new cardiovascular unit. My brother Brandon, finishing his master's degree at Yale with honors, discreetly showing off the expensive watch he had bought with his first internship bonus. My mother Catherine, an assistant dean at a university, whose pursed lips spoke more disappointment than any words could. "I'm working on an accessibility app for people with learning disabilities," I replied, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice. "It will help people with dyslexia and other cognitive challenges to—" "Another project that's going nowhere," my mother interrupted with a sigh. "Ruby, we need to talk about adult expectations." The argument escalated quickly. Years of accumulated tension exploded when I found out that my prototypes and codes, months of work, had been thrown away because my mother cleaned up that mess in the guest room. "This house values education and excellence," my father finally exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "If you can't contribute as a functional adult with a degree and a real job, maybe it's time you find out how the real world works." That night, I left with a backpack containing a few clothes, $267 in savings, and an old laptop. No degree, no connections, no family. What I didn't know in that freezing December moment was that being thrown out would be the first step in a journey that would take me exactly where I needed to be. The Fosters weren't just a family. They were an institution of academic excellence. My father, Richard, PhD in economics from Princeton, had published 6 acclaimed books on economic theory. My mother, Catherine, assistant dean, collected diplomas like trophies on the wall of her office. Our house near Harvard Square was a gathering, place for laureates, researchers, and future leaders, as my parents liked to call their protégés. Growing up in that environment meant only one thing. Either you excelled academically, or you vanished. Melissa and Brandon chose to shine. I was different. From an early age, I struggled with printed words that seemed to dance on the page. Teachers called me distracted or lazy, despite my obvious talent with technology and solving practical problems. At 12, I took apart and rebuilt our family computer to make it run faster. At 15, I created a system to organize the school library when I realized I couldn't find books through traditional cataloging. Interesting skills, but what matters are grades, my father would say when I tried to show him my creations. The comparisons were constant and relentless. Melissa had already published a scientific paper at that age. Brandon won the state legal debate championship at 16. I tried to fit in. I really did. I enrolled in state college, then transferred to a tech program, then tried night classes. Every attempt ended the same way: mediocre grades on written exams, even though I often outperformed everyone in hands-on projects. Readings that felt like climbing impossible walls. Teachers impatient with my obvious questions. For years, I believed I was stupid. Not in the way my parents whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. A waste of potential. Truly stupid. But then something fascinating happened every time I worked with computers and code. The world made sense. Everything clicked. I was creating solutions no one else had thought of. "I don't understand why you waste time with these games," my mother would say, watching me code late into the night. "That won't lead anywhere without the proper credentials." My first apps were simple, tools that helped me organize my thoughts, visualize texts in different ways, turn words into patterns my brain could better process. Without knowing it, I was creating solutions for my own undiagnosed dyslexia. When I mentioned the possibility of building a career as an independent software developer, the reaction was ruthless. "Programmers without degrees are easily replaceable," my father declared. "Besides, tech startups are for people who fail in academia." Melissa often helped with condescending advice. "Ruby, sweetie, I don't know why you insist on this path. There are basic technical courses even you could complete." Brandon was more direct. "Nobody takes people without degrees seriously. That's just how the market works." It was in this context that I developed my biggest project so far, an app that transformed text into personalized visual formats, using color patterns, spacing, and special fonts to make reading accessible to people with cognitive difficulties. I worked on it secretly for months, genuinely believing that this time, my family would see the value in what I was creating. This was the project I found in the trash on that fateful Christmas night. The project I had mentioned at the dinner table before being effectively kicked out of the house. The project that, ironically, would become the cornerstone of my future billion-dollar company. In the first weeks after being kicked out, sleeping on a friend's couch and working in coffee shops with free Wi-Fi, I often thought about the look of disappointment in my father's eyes. "You'll never be anything without a degree," were his final words. "The real world is going to teach you a hard lesson." He was right about one thing. The real world definitely had many lessons to teach me, just not the ones he imagined. Boston in January is ruthless, especially when you're sleeping on a cramped couch in an overheated apartment with 4 other people, surviving on poorly paid freelance programming gigs while trying to rebuild your project from scratch. The first month was brutal, waking up at 5 in the morning to get in 2 hours of coding before my barista shift. Nights spent coding in 24-hour diners because the apartment was taken over by roommates' parties. Short messages to my mom, "I'm alive, don't worry," just to keep her from calling the police. After 6 weeks, I had a functional prototype of my accessibility app. Imperfect, but promising. That's when I saw the announcement for the Hackathon for Inclusion, a 48-hour event to develop assistive technologies. The prize, $5,000, would mean months of rent and full-time focus on developing my idea. This is going to be my breakthrough, I told myself, ignoring the inner voices that sounded suspiciously like my parents. Without credentials, you don't stand a chance. I arrived early at the event, carrying my old laptop and a giant bottle of coffee. Under the fluorescent lights of a corporate building, dozens of programmers clustered in groups. Harvard, MIT, Stanford. The university hats and t-shirts felt like they were mocking me. For 48 hours, I coded like never before. No sleep, barely eating. When my computer crashed at 4 in the morning, I cried for 10 minutes and then kept going on a borrowed laptop. The final presentation was set for 2 p.m. on Sunday. While waiting for my turn, I watched impressive presentations from polished university teams. Apps with sleek designs, refined academic terminology, flawless slides. My heart sank. What was I even doing here? Next up, Ruby Foster, the moderator announced. I climbed on stage with trembling knees. No fancy slides, just me and my rough app. "This is Read Worlds," I began, my voice shaky at first. "It may not be the prettiest one here today, but it does something none of the others do." Instead of a technical explanation, I showed them. I opened a dense academic text and activated the app. The words reorganized themselves, colors highlighted patterns, spacing dynamically adjusted. I have undiagnosed dyslexia, I publicly admitted for the first time. For years, I thought I was less intelligent than others because I couldn't process text the way most people do. This app doesn't just help with reading, it transforms the cognitive experience of text. I demonstrated how the app allowed customization for different cognitive needs, how it created real-time visual maps of concepts, how it turned impenetrable academic articles into accessible experiences. I built this because I needed it, and I suspect millions of others do too. When I finished, there was a brief silence before the applause began. The judges asked sharp questions, which I answered with the authority of someone who has lived the problem they're solving. I didn't win first prize. I came in third, won $500, not the $5,000 I had hoped for. The initial disappointment quickly faded when a man, in his 60s with gray hair and worn sneakers, approached me after the ceremony. "I'm Jackson Wright, from Horizon Tech." He introduced himself, skipping formalities. "Your app is fascinating, not for what it is now, but for what it represents." We talked for nearly 2 hours, not about degrees or credentials, but about vision, user experience, and the future of assistive technology. Jackson shared how he founded Horizon Tech after decades in the industry, seeking to create technologies that truly impact lives. Lots of people can write beautiful code. He noted, examining my app. Few truly understand the problems they're trying to solve. You have something rare. Just when I was expecting to hear, stay in touch for future opportunities. Jackson surprised me. I need someone like you at Horizon. I don't need another elite programmer. I've got dozens of those. I need someone who sees what others don't. I left the hackathon with more than a third-place prize. I walked away with a job as a developer at Horizon Tech, a small but promising company focused on assistive technology. The salary was modest, but it included health insurance, a luxury I had never had before, under any circumstances. You're making a mistake, one of the other judges warned Jackson as we were leaving. She doesn't have the proper qualifications. That's exactly why I hired her, Jackson replied with a smile. Sometimes we need people who think outside the box because they've never been forced into it. That night, sleeping on the same uncomfortable couch, I realized I had found something my family had never offered. Someone who saw my worth not despite my differences, but because of them. My first day at Horizon Tech revealed a world far from the academic perfection of the Fosters. The office occupied 2 floors of a renovated industrial building. Desks were arranged in circles, not in rows. Walls were covered with colorful post-its and what seemed like chaotic diagrams. People in sneakers and hoodies worked intensely, occasionally tossing stress balls at each other. Welcome to our organized mess, introduced Zoe Chen, director of ITO. Innovation, as she led me around the space. In her early 30s, with purple hair, multiple piercings, and a PhD in cognitive neuroscience that she mentioned only in passing. What university did you go to? She asked casually, while setting up my workstation. None, officially, I replied, bracing for the familiar look of disappointment. Lucky you, she surprised me with a grin. No academic bad habits to unlearn? In the weeks that followed, I dove headfirst into developing what would become Read Worlds. To an OOM, Jackson insisted we keep the original name. Never hide your roots, he advised. They shape your authenticity. The difference between Horizon and any other environment I'd ever known was profound. Here, results mattered more than credentials. Ideas were judged on their merit, not on the status of the person who proposed them. When I suggested a radically different approach to our personalization system, no one asked if I had academic backing. They just asked me to show how it worked. 3 months after I started, I received my official diagnosis of dyslexia. Jackson not only covered the cost of the testing, but also gave me 2 days off to process your new understanding of yourself, as he put it. This isn't a disability, he said when I returned. It's a different cognitive configuration, and we're going to use that strategically. He was right. I began to realize how my personal experience informed innovations others simply couldn't imagine. Where traditional programmers built technically perfect interfaces, I could immediately spot invisible barriers painted on for people with different cognitive processing. My tiny apartment was replaced by a more spacious place, still modest, but mine. For the first time, I had financial stability and a clear purpose. Occasionally, I would get emails from family, mostly my mom asking when I would go back to school. In the first year, Read Worlds was officially launched and surpassed all sales expectations. Schools, universities, and companies adopted it as a standard accessibility tool. More importantly, we received hundreds of messages from users whose educational lives had been transformed. Jackson promoted me to lead a team dedicated to cognitive accessibility products. Under my leadership, we developed complementary tools. Voice Map, to navigate information verbally. Structure View, to visualize the hierarchy of complex documents. Emotion Track, to help neurodivergent individuals interpret emotional contexts in written communications. Every promotion brought the temptation to share my success with my family. Every award the company received made me imagine their reaction, but the few interactions we had only reinforced the chasm between our worldviews. Good that you found something for now, my mom commented when I mentioned my promotion to director. Still, with a degree, you'd get so much further. In my 4th year at Horizon, something extraordinary happened. Our team developed an educational platform that integrated all our tools, allowing complete personalization of the learning experience. Prestigious universities began adopting it. Ironically, Harvard, my sister's alma mater, was one of the first to implement the system on a large scale. Horizon had grown from a promising startup to a powerhouse in assistive technology, valued at hundreds of millions. Our products not only dominated the educational market, but also expanded into corporate, government, and healthcare sectors. During this time, Jackson became the mentor I never had. Not molding me into a version of himself, but helping me develop my own strengths. "Ruby, you have a rare skill," he told me during one of our weekly chats. "It's not just about code. It's about seeing patterns and opportunities that others can't because they're too conditioned by conventional training." In my 5th year, Jackson called an unexpected meeting. With his health weakened after a mild heart attack, he announced his intention to step back from daily operations. "The board and I are searching for the next CEO," he explained to the small group of directors. "We need someone who fundamentally understands our mission." Looking directly at me, he continued, "Ruby has developed not only products, but an entirely new philosophy that integrates cognitive diversity as a competitive advantage. The results speak for themselves." The nomination to run for CEO felt surreal. At 32 years old, without a college degree, I would be competing against external candidates with elite MBAs and decades of traditional experience. The selection process lasted 2 intense months. While other candidates presented impressive credentials, I focused on tangible results and innovative vision. For my final presentation, I used no corporate buzzwords or academic jargon. I delivered an authentic vision of how Horizon could fundamentally transform society's relationship with different cognitive styles. 1 week later, alone, in my apartment, I received the call that would change everything. "Ruby?" Jackson's voice sounded unusually formal. "The board has voted unanimously. Starting next month, you will be the CEO of Horizon Technology Solutions." That same evening, as if by some cosmic coincidence, I received an email from my mother. The annual family gathering would be held next month, celebrating my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. "Your presence would be truly appreciated," she wrote. "The family just isn't the same without you." After 7 years of near-complete estrangement, I decided to accept, not for revenge or to show off success, but for a deeper reason I would only fully understand when facing my past in person. In the weeks between my appointment as CEO and the family gathering, I lived in Tianjin. 2 parallel worlds. Days were spent in intense preparations for my transition into Horizon's leadership. Meetings with investors, presentations to employees, interviews with industry press. Nights were consumed by reflections on the imminent family reunion. "How do you plan to tell them?" Zoe asked during our weekly lunch, now my director of innovation. And sure I, closest friend, she knew all the details about my history with my family. "I haven't decided yet," I confessed. "Part of me wants to show up in a Lamborghini and toss business cards like confetti." We laughed, but we both knew the issue was serious. This reunion was more than just a family event. It was a direct confrontation with the people who had defined my worth, solely by academic metrics. Following Jackson's recommendation, I had a few sessions with Edie Durst and Dr. Marina, Horizon's corporate psychologist. "Don't seek validation," she advised. "You've already proven yourself. This is about closure, not approval." The day before the reunion, I received significant updates about my family. Through discreet research, Melissa had been promoted to head of department at the university hospital. Brandon was now working at a prestigious law firm, representing my technology sector clients. My father was still teaching, but also served as a consultant for an investment bank specializing in technology. Ironically, they all professionally orbited the very world that had embraced me, without knowing I now held a central role within it. Instead of flaunting my newly acquired status, I chose a deliberately low-key approach. I drove my father's modest Honda Civic to Boston, wore my comfortable but simple clothes, and intentionally left behind all external symbols of success that I could have easily displayed. Standing in front of my parents' house, the same house I had left with nothing but a backpack, 7 years earlier, I felt a strange sense of dissociation. The once intimidating Victorian mansion now seemed oddly smaller, less significant. "You are the CEO of Horizon Tech," I whispered to myself before ringing the doorbell. "You don't need their approval." The door opened, revealing my mother. 7 years older, but still just as composed. Her awkward embrace conveyed the unresolved ambivalence between us. "Ruby, you came. What? A pleasant surprise." Her gaze quickly scanned my appearance, clearly evaluating and categorizing. "Come in. Everyone is excited to see you." The room was filled with the usual collection of academics, doctors, and lawyers that made up the Foster family's social circle. Nearly everyone carried that same air of educational superiority that had made me feel inadequate for so many years. "Ruby," Melissa exclaimed, approaching with a performance-worthy enthusiasm for a superficial hug, still dazzling in her designer dress, exuding the scent of superiority cultivated since childhood. "It's been so long. How is everything?" The hesitation before that last word carried volumes of unspoken meaning. "How is your aimless life? How are you surviving without the proper credentials?" "I'm doing well," I replied simply. "I work in tech in Boston." "How wonderful," she answered with a condescending smile. "Tech support?" Before I could respond, Brandon strolled over, ostentatiously displaying a watch that probably cost more than my first annual salary at Horizon. "The rebel returns," he joked, seemingly friendly but with that familiar undertone of condescension. "Still working on those apps of yours?" "Something like that," I replied vaguely, accepting a glass of wine offered by a staff member. My father finally emerged from his study, looking both older and unchanging, like an academic monument resisting the passage of time. "Ruby," he greeted formally, "I hope you're well established by now." "I have my own apartment and a steady job," I answered, technically true, though deliberately incomplete. Dinner continued with the predictable Foster dynamic, Melissa dominating. The conversation with dramatic medical rescue stories, Brandon cutting in to casually name-drop his billionaire clients, my mother skillfully steering the conversation to highlight the family's accomplishments. Then, unexpectedly, the conversation shifted to the topic that seemed to be on everyone's mind: Horizon Tech. "Richard is absolutely obsessed with that company," my mother commented, touching my father's arm. "The bank he advises is desperate to get in on the next funding round. Their technology is revolutionary." My father agreed with unusual enthusiasm. "Especially their educational platform. It's completely transforming teaching methodologies that have been stagnant for decades." "The hospital just implemented their system," Melissa added. "The interface is extraordinarily intuitive, clearly developed by someone who understands how different minds process information." Brandon wasn't about to be left out. "My firm is bidding to represent them legally. The previous CEO is stepping down, and the new one is supposedly a genius in assistive technology. I hear they only hire from top universities now," my mother added meaningfully, glancing in my direction. "Extremely selective." "Maybe you could try something administrative there, Ruby," Melissa suggested with fake kindness. "I'm sure they need people for support tasks." At that moment, my phone vibrated in my pocket, Normally, I'd ignore it during a family dinner, but I recognized the special ringtone reserved for executive emergencies. "Sorry, I need to take this," I said, stepping away from the table. It was Zoe, her voice urgent. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but we need your approval for the next-gen acquisition. The board is waiting for your final word before moving forward." "Final numbers?" I asked, aware of the curious glances from the table. "50 million, as we discussed. Documents are ready for digital signature." "Approved. Send the contracts to my personal email. I'll sign them within 30 minutes. Returning to the table, I found the air thick with expectation. "Work trouble?" my father asked, his tone slightly condescending. "Nothing critical," I replied casually. "They just needed my sign-off on an acquisition." "Acquisition?" Brandon echoed, obvious skepticism in his voice. "What kind of company would need your approval for something like that?" The moment had come. No unnecessary drama, no declared revenge, just the simple unveiling of the truth I had worked tirelessly to build. I pulled a business card from my purse and slid it across the dinner table. That company. Printed simply on the card, Ruby Foster, CEO, Horizon Technology Solutions. The silence that fell over the table was so complete I could hear the ticking of the old pendulum clock in the hallway. My father stared at the card as if it were written in indecipherable hieroglyphs. My mother visibly paled. Melissa froze with her fork suspended midair. Brandon was the first to react, picking up the card and turning it over and over as if searching for signs of forgery. "Is this some kind of joke?" he finally asked, a slight tremor in his voice betraying his controlled facade. Calmly, I picked up my phone and opened the official press release from the previous week, showing my photo next to Jackson Wright. Then I opened Zoe's email about the $50 million acquisition, clearly sitting in my inbox. "I officially took over the role 2 weeks ago," I explained with a calmness that even surprised me. "I've worked at Horizon for 7 years, first as a developer, then leading our accessibility division." But my mother seemed to be searching for words, something extraordinarily rare for her. "You said you worked in tech. We thought that meant something smaller." "ReadWorlds was my original creation," I continued. "That same project I found in the trash that Christmas Eve. The system your hospital just implemented, Melissa? I built it. The bank that's desperate to invest, Dad? They're evaluating a company I now lead." As the impact of my revelation reverberated, I watched their expressions shift like emotional kaleidoscopes. Initial shock turning into disbelief, then an awkward attempt to completely recalibrate our family dynamic. "I always knew you had a special talent for computers," my mom began, quickly reconstructing the narrative. "I remember how creative you always were with technology." My father, partially regaining his composure, also tried to claim credit. "Well, I suppose our push for you to prove yourself in the real world worked out after all." Brandon, always the strategist, immediately shifted into opportunistic mode. "We should definitely discuss how my firm could benefit Horizon. We already represent several cutting-edge tech companies." Melissa, for her part, forced a dazzling smile. "That's incredible, Ruby. I always believed in you. We should definitely explore potential collaborations between my department and your company." The retired economics professor sitting to my left, one of my father's longtime friends, leaned in with genuine curiosity. "Forgive me, but isn't Horizon valued at nearly $1 billion? How did you get to that position without an MBA or PhD?" The question silenced the table again. It was exactly the point the entire Foster family was carefully avoiding. "Horizon values results over credentials," I answered simply. Jackson Wright, our founder, built a culture that recognizes different kinds of intelligence and capability. I realized I had everyone's full attention for the first time in my life. I decided to use this moment not for humiliation, but for honest education. I discovered I have dyslexia at 26. My whole life, through school and failed college attempts, I was fighting something I didn't understand. I was labeled lazy, inattentive, or rebellious when, in reality, my brain just processes information differently. My father frowned. Dyslexia? But we had you tested as a child. Standard tests often don't catch specific forms of neurodivergence, I explained, especially in girls who develop sophisticated coping mechanisms. You should have told us, my mother protested weakly. How could I? In this house, a person's worth was measured solely by traditional academic achievements. An uncomfortable silence followed. I was determined not to waste this rare opportunity for open dialogue. Horizon isn't just about tech or profit, I continued. We build tools that transform lives for people the conventional systems ignore. People like me, who think and learn differently. With all due respect, my father interjected, trying to regain familiar ground. Surely you could have gone even further with proper credentials. Maybe now you could consider finishing an MBA to solidify your position? I almost laughed at the predictability of that comment. A degree wouldn't teach me to think differently. It would teach me to think exactly like all of you. I paused, carefully choosing my next words. And then our solutions would be identical to all the others that have failed people like me for decades. Melissa, a doctor trained to observe details, was studying me with renewed interest. That's why ReadWorlds works so well, because you truly understand the user experience. Exactly. We don't create based on theoretical studies about accessibility. We create from lived experience and real need. One of the guests, a computer science professor I didn't know, broke the awkward silence. Fascinating. Horizon really revolutionized adaptive interfaces. I'm curious about your vision for artificial intelligence in cognitive personalization. The conversation gradually shifted, with several guests now directing genuinely interested questions about technology and innovation toward me. For the first time, I was being heard in that house not as the rebellious daughter, but as a respected authority. I noticed my parents exchanging complex glances, reluctant pride mixed with clear confusion about how to recalibrate their entire understanding of success and value. When dinner finally ended and the guests began to leave, Brandon approached me with what was practically a fully formed business proposal. We should talk about legal representation. My firm has substantial experience in intellectual property for tech companies. Send a formal proposal to our legal department, I replied professionally. They'll assess it on merit, as we do with all potential partners. Melissa also found a moment in private. I'm working with patients who've suffered cognitive damage after strokes. Your technology could make an extraordinary difference for them. Set up a meeting with our medical applications team, I suggested, genuinely interested. It sounds like a promising collaboration. Before leaving, my father asked to speak privately in his office, the same office where, years ago, he would often scold me for bad grades and wasted potential. Ruby, he began, clearly uncomfortable. I have to admit I'm surprised. Impressed, certainly, but also confused. How did this happen without us knowing? I kept my distance because every interaction came with expectations that I would complete a conventional education. I needed space to build my own path. He nodded slowly, processing. I suppose we had very different views on what constitutes success. We still do, Dad. The difference is that now I have results you respect to back up my vision. It wasn't exactly an apology on his part, nor a full reconciliation. But it was. Perhaps the beginning of something new, a reluctant acknowledgement that there are many paths to meaning and purpose. As I left, I noticed my old high school graduation photo still hanging on the wall, the only formal educational achievement I ever reached under Foster standards. Beside it, empty space where certificates and diplomas should have been. I smiled slightly. Maybe someday, a Horizon Tech CEO business card would find its place there. In the weeks following that family gathering, my phone barely stopped ringing. After years of minimal contact, suddenly the entire Foster family wanted to reconnect. Every message carried a curious mix of newfound pride and awkward attempts to redefine our relationship. My father sent a long email detailing articles about self-taught CEOs and subtly suggesting that I could complement my practical experience with an executive MBA. Even Steve Jobs eventually recognized the value of formal education, he argued, apparently unable to fully let go of his worldview. My mother, always concerned with social appearances, invited me to speak at her university about non-conventional paths to success, an irony not lost on me, considering how many times she lamented my lack of conventionality. Brandon, ever the opportunist, sent a detailed proposal for Horizon's legal representation, full of references to family synergies and an intimate understanding of your values. I forwarded the document to our legal department for an unbiased review, as promised. The surprise came from Melissa. Instead of transparent attempts to capitalize on our connection, she sent a surprisingly thoughtful message. I always thought I was helping you with my advice. I now realize I was imposing my definition of success onto your life. As a doctor, I should have asked deeper questions when you were struggling academically. I would genuinely like to hear your full story whenever you're ready to share it. This unexpected opening led us to schedule a lunch where, for the first time, we talked as adults on equal footing. I openly shared my journey with undiagnosed dyslexia, the years of struggle, and the chance encounter with Jackson that changed everything. It's fascinating how our brains process information differently, she commented, now interested not only professionally but also personally. At the hospital, I work with patients who've suffered neurological damage after strokes. Many face challenges similar to what people with dyslexia describe. That conversation led to something unexpected, a genuine professional collaboration. Over the following months, we developed a pilot project adapting Horizon technology for cognitive rehabilitation of neurological patients. Melissa's medical perspective, combined with my experience in adaptive interfaces, created something truly innovative. To my surprise, that professional collaboration began to heal old personal wounds. Working together as equals, we rediscovered a long-lost connection. With my parents, the evolution was slower and more complex. During a dinner 3 months after the revelation, my father finally addressed the elephant in the room. I failed to recognize other forms of intelligence, he admitted, visibly uncomfortable. I've spent decades studying economic systems, but I applied a single rigid model to my own household. It wasn't exactly an apology, but for a man who had built his entire identity on academic certainties, it was a significant concession. Education and knowledge do matter, Dad, I replied, just not exclusively in the way you always valued. On the professional front, Horizon continued to thrive under my leadership. We expanded our product line and philosophy, becoming a benchmark not only in technology, but also in truly inclusive work practices. In a particularly meaningful initiative, we established the Horizon Pathfinders program, scholarships and mentorships for neurodivergent youth interested in technology. The program deliberately did not require formal academic credentials, focusing instead on demonstrated potential and genuine passion. To my surprise, my mother eventually became a vocal advocate for the program at her university, challenging her colleagues to recognize the limitations of traditional evaluative methods. Ruby taught me that we are losing extraordinary talent by insisting on standardized metrics of ability. I heard her say during an educational conference, words I never imagined would come out of Catherine Foster. 1 year after that revealing family meeting, I hosted a special event at Horizon, the launch of the Tri-Shaw's Jackson Wright Foundation for Inclusive Innovation, following my mentor's recent retirement. Among the guests, sitting uncomfortably but visibly impressed, were my parents. When I met Ruby, Jackson said during his speech, she had just been kicked out of her home for being considered useless by conventional standards of success. My parents visibly shifted in their seats. Today, she leads a billion-dollar company that is redefining how we value different types of minds, not despite thinking differently, but precisely because of it. In my own speech, I avoided any direct reference to my family's past, focusing instead on the future we were building, a world where human potential is recognized in all its diverse forms. After the ceremony, I found my father thoughtfully observing our Wall of Honor, where we displayed stories of users whose lives had been transformed by Horizon's technology. I've built my entire career studying value systems, he said when I approached. Economic, social, educational. I always believed that functional systems required standardized metrics. He paused meaningfully. Your company has made me question decades of assumptions. I hope that's a good thing, I replied. Uncomfortable, certainly, but necessary. He hesitated before adding, I'm proud of you, Ruby. Not for the title or the financial success, but for creating something genuinely meaningful, entirely on your own terms. Those words, so simple yet so long desired, stirred an emotion I wasn't expecting. Not because I still desperately needed their approval, but because they represented a transformation that few people ever achieve, the genuine acknowledgement that our most deeply held truths might be incomplete. Being kicked out of my home for being deemed useless was painful and traumatic. But ironically, it was precisely that rejection that allowed me to discover my true worth, free from the limiting expectations that had always surrounded me. Today, I lead Horizon not to prove anything to my family, but because we create technology that truly changes lives. We've built a corporate culture that recognizes how the most innovative minds often don't follow conventional paths. Every time we receive messages from users whose academic or professional lives have been transformed by our tools, I remember that desperate young woman who walked away with nothing but a backpack and a dream, dismissed as irrelevant. As I often say in my talks, sometimes the people who should believe in you can't see beyond their own narrow definitions of success. Don't let other people's limited vision define your boundaries. The world needs precisely the kind of mind you have, exactly as it is,